Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong. Today, exciting book for you. This book was the best book, or the best book of the month on Amazon.com in March of this year. And it's been so popular, it's taken me a while to get to the author and land the interview. So I'm real excited about this book, Between Man and Beast, by Monty Reel. And this book, the entire title with the subtitles, Between Man and Beast, An Unlikely Explorer, The Evolution Debates, and the African Adventure That Took the Victorian World by Storm. Long title, but important to understand that there are two adventures here. The adventure in the African jungles and the adventure in the Victorian salons of England as part of the evolution debate. So we'll talk about both of those things. But on Amazon, for instance, it goes on for about 3 pages on just raving reviews for this book. One I particularly liked was from the Wall Street Journal. It said that the book was engrossing and would go great with popcorn. It addresses big topics, evolution, abolition, but they remain in service to a provocative narrative. That's a particularly fun, but I think accurate endorsement of the book. Hi, Monty. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for taking the time to join us. This is a quite unusual book in that it brings back a person kind of lost to history, and yet he played an incredibly important role in the history of African exploration and the great debate over evolution.
Yeah, his name is Paul Du Chaillu, and he is a person who just sort of fell through the cracks, as you mentioned, in history, and not a lot of people know of him now. Mm-hmm. And until a few years ago, several years ago, I hadn't heard of him either. Uh-huh. And that was sort of what sparked my interest in this initially, was who is this guy? I was reading a lot about explorers and African exploration in general. And this name popped up, and it was new. And once I started looking into the story, trying to figure out who he was, the story I found it to be really interesting, and it grabbed me. And the more I looked into him, the more interesting he became. So it just kind of built from there for me. But it started because I didn't know who he was.
Well, I like the way, the Daily Beast talks about your book. It says, before there was Jane Goodall, before there was Tarzan, before there was King Kong, the gorilla was a creature of mystery, and Reel retraces his life and work, Paul Du Chaillu, with the spirit of curiosity and adventure that drove Du Chaillu in the first place. So it puts you in the context of the explorer. And also, I think it helps, as you retrace in your book, the notion that most people don't know that the gorilla was a mystery and even perceived by many as a myth.
Yeah, the very first gorilla skull was actually not even discovered until 1846, 1847. And at that time, nobody knew what it was. Obviously, it was this new animal, and the person who discovered it was a missionary, an American missionary. It was brought to him by native African traders, and it was just this mystery that the local hunters called an angina was the term that they had for this animal. And this missionary, his name was John Leighton Wilson, he ended up actually becoming sort of the father figure, kind of an adoptive father for Paul Du Chaillu. Mm-hmm. When Du Chaillu was a teenager, he essentially moved in with Wilson and his wife, and so he was there right really from the beginning, from when the gorilla was this sort of mythical animal. And Wilson at that point was trying to collect as much information as he could about it, and the stories that he collected were just incredibly fantastical. They spoke of, just sort of a monster in the forest with supernatural strength.
So they described it like many would later describe King Kong.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There were all sorts of stories. It was kind of a forest folklore that had built up around the gorilla. and it was known as an animal that was practically impossible to kill.
Mm-hmm.
It was talked about as being extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily violent.
So would you say there are corollaries to the mythology of Bigfoot? If we extrapolated that from our time to their time, would that be similar?
Kind of, yeah. It was one of those animals. Gorillas are they're hard to stumble across,
mm-hmm.
especially in equatorial Africa.
Yeah.
The jungle's very dense. Gorillas tend to live in places where it's very hard for humans to go. And they're not an animal that is particularly gregarious. They're kind of shy. And so they would avoid contact with people.
Well, you went there yourself looking for them, didn't you?
Yeah, I actually went to a couple of camps, research camps
mm-hmm.
in Gabon. And one of the camps was a small camp of scientists who were trying to get gorillas used to human presence, just
mm-hmm.
their own human presence
yes.
out in the jungle, so that they can observe them. Because this particular subspecies of gorilla, the western lowland gorilla, this is the kind that Du Chaillu originally encountered. They are the hardest to observe in the wild. Mountain gorillas, which are commonly seen in Rwanda, for example, they're a lot easier to observe because they live in places that are sort of less dense in terms of the forest, and they don't range widely. But lowland gorillas cover an enormous territory, so it's hard to sort of observe them for an extended time. So the camp that I visited was a small camp of scientists and local trackers from Gabon who were trying to basically set up a situation where they could observe a group of gorillas over a period of time. And they had been doing this for a couple of years, and they still hadn't really got to the point where they were able to consistently observe in the way that they wanted. It takes a long time to build that. So that was one camp that I visited, and then another camp that I visited was actually one that took captured gorillas, gorillas that had been, for example, captured when they were juveniles and had grown, and they were trying to reintroduce them back into the wild, to rehabituate them. So it was kind of two opposite camps. But I visited those two places just
and
to try
to get... And did you
see
some yourself?
Yes. Which is really kind of an incredible experience. They're just incredibly interesting animals, and we know now that they don't. They're not particularly dangerous to humans. They will charge you. The male silverback large gorillas will charge you, but that's a display to try to kind of scare you away. But they won't actually charge you the whole way. They'll veer off before they generally, would make contact.
So you just have to stand your ground, and they will leave you alone.
Yeah, you have to sort of be submissive in a way. And talking to the scientists who were, trying to observe gorillas, they were explaining to me how incredibly difficult that is.
I bet it is.
To even after years of trying to do this every time one charges, it's still this feeling of incredible fear.
Because they weigh like 700 pounds, right?
They're a little smaller than that, but more than 400 pounds, and they're just everything about them. In this display, when they charge, it's designed to scare you.
Yes.
Well,
like in the story that Du Chaillu tells, is that one in his party, when they were out hunting, they just found his body, right? And the gun was bent double.
Right, the barrel of the gun was bent, and so stories sort of kind of went around after that the gorilla had grabbed the gun and bent it, and actually had bitten it because there were some marks on the barrel. That story was of course attacked as probably
mythology.
Fiction. Yeah. It's interesting to note, though, that it's not impossible that could have happened. The guns in those days, particularly the ones that these hunters were using, the barrels were actually quite flimsy compared to guns today.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have been that incredible for a charging animal to bend the barrel.
So a human couldn't do it, but these gorillas have extraordinary strength.
Right. Yes.
And okay, well, let's go back to Paul and what made him. I mean, you went there and you saw how hard it is to find them, so you probably gained great respect for his achievement.
When he was, as I mentioned before, he was kind of a teenager who was growing up in Wilson's household. He was really being steeped in these stories of the gorilla, and so there was a natural curiosity on his part. He had always been sort of adventurous. He had already kind of developed a knowledge of the local tribes there. He spoke a little bit of their language. He knew the area as well as really anybody on the coast knew the area at that time, the rivers leading into the equatorial forest. And this was an area that really was unexplored. And whenever he was in his 20s, he actually went to the United States. Wilson, the missionary, had arranged for him to teach French at a school in New York. And when he was there in New York, he found that the stories that he told people about his time in Africa really kind of lit up their interest. And while he was there, he made some contacts with some scientific societies. And that's where the idea to go back and to try to kind of methodically go into the forest and try to encounter gorillas, be the first person to describe them in the wild, to see them in the wild and describe them. And his idea was to collect specimens. So that's where the idea was born. So he actually went from the United States back to Africa, back to Gabon, and he went into the forest on what would become essentially a 3-year expedition. And the idea was to try to encounter gorillas and hopefully to bring some back. He was a hunter. He went in with guns with the idea that he would try to hunt this beast that was the subject of so much legend and folklore.
And he knew this would make him famous.
Yeah, there was a lot of interest in African exploration at that time. It was considered sort of this, open territory that was still a mystery, going in there and being a person who could kind of lay bare this blank spot on the map and color that in was something that was, for anyone who kind of had that sort of sense of adventure, it was pretty irresistible, and especially for someone like Du Chaillu, who had a bit of knowledge of the area and who, like I said, he was right there, sort of steeped in these stories. So he had kind of a stake in this, and so his idea was to go back, and he obviously knew that if he were able to do this, it would cause quite a sensation.
Well, just to set the context, at this time, some of the best-selling books in London were books on Africa, like Livingstone's books were all the rage, and they were bestsellers, right? Yeah,
and African explorers were becoming celebrities. Like Livingstone was really incredibly famous. It's hard to imagine today an explorer being that well known, but his book was the equivalent of just a blockbuster bestseller. He was kind of a national hero in England, and the Royal Geographical Society at that time, they were an institution that was sponsoring a lot of these expeditions in Africa, and they actually did quite a bit to promote people like Livingstone, because obviously more publicity, more support to their institution, It meant more support from the British government. And so the idea of the African explorer, or the lions of Africa as they were known, in the 1850s particularly, that's when it really took off. And that coincided with Du Chaillu's trip into Africa. He kind of went in there right at the height of that trend.
And then when he came out, and we'll come back to his first journey in a minute, but I just want to connect the dots. When he came out and he essentially produced a book, and that book also became, like Livingstone's, a bestseller.
Yeah, it was a real sensation, and his road to get there wasn't straight. He first went back to the U.S. He took his specimens. He emerged from the jungle after those 3 years with more than 20 stuffed gorillas.
And one other thing I want to talk about, he actually captured some babies, but they didn't survive, right?
Right. Yeah. They actually died, and he wasn't able to maintain a living specimen.
Now, is this a consistent problem with gorillas, that they die from separation anxiety?
Well, especially at that time, no one knew anything about them.
Yeah.
And so the care for them was crude, to say the least. And so it was very difficult to take, particularly an infant gorilla or a very young gorilla, which were the ones that he was able to capture during that first expedition.
So he comes back with his 20 gorilla collection.
Yeah.
and he goes to New York.
He went to Broadway, and he actually opened sort of a showroom right on Broadway. The problem was it was very close to P.T. Barnum's showroom. And
you just can't make this stuff up, I tell you.
No,
it's just so bizarre.
It really is incredible. And Barnum, of course, was the ultimate showman. And he did not want to be upstaged by someone who was coming with this new, incredible animal that he was putting on display. So Barnum actually created a fake. He put on display what he called a living sort of missing link. He called it the What Is It? And he took huge advertisements in the New York papers to promote this new, African animal, something between a human and an ape, he said. It was actually a hoax, and it was a man essentially dressed in a monkey suit. And this was all also happening right at the beginning of what would become the Civil War. Yeah. So New York was in kind of this, it had a lot on its mind as a city. And so Du Chaillu was kind of lost there. For the months that he was on Broadway, he didn't make that much of a splash.
So it's so bizarre because he's sitting there with the real thing,
yes,
the authentic thing, and then 3 blocks away, you got a fake that's getting far more business.
And it's so funny to look at the papers at those times to see how both are, when you look at the pages of the advertisements for both, you see Du Chaillu's museum, he called it. The advertisements for that are about an inch long, just tiny little boxes in the paper, and whereas P.T. Barnum's are huge full-page ads about the What Is It. So he was totally sort of overshadowed by Barnum. But he then went to London, and that's where the specimens really kind of took off, and they became an incredible sensation and kind of went from London to the rest of the world. And that's, the gorilla became, it entered pop culture at that time, and it became kind of the face of the evolution debate at that moment whenever he first displayed them in London.
Well, that's the other important intersection that you develop here, is that not only did he come into public notoriety at a time where Africa was of great importance in the general mind, but you also have the evolution debate, and he unwittingly, I guess, became a flashpoint in that debate.
Yeah, his timing really could not have been I, depending on your perspective,
yes.
better or
yes,
worse.
Yes.
He came out of Africa with those specimens in November of 1859. That's exactly the moment that Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time he got to London, the Darwinian debate was really just kind of taking off. And so he shows up in London with this new specimen that he displays and speaks of, telling stories about his encounters with them in the forest. And it's being described as mankind's closest relative in the animal kingdom. So it's just this, it was a spark. It became something that people seized upon. And guerrilla fever is what they called it. It really consumed London. At that time, there were plays that were staged about gorillas. There were musicals that were launched during the summer that this was sort of unveiled. Mm-hmm. There was even a short-lived dance craze called the Gorilla Quadrille.
Really?
And, yeah, there was somebody wrote some music and a song about gorillas and about Du Chaillu, and this was converted into a sort of dance, and so all of this was swirling around in the spring and summer of 1861, and at that time also Du Chaillu's account, his book about his adventures, was the bestseller in the English-speaking world.
And then did very well in America also, right?
Yes, yeah. And even during the Civil War in 1861, when the Civil War had already started, this book, by some figures, it's hard to come up with bestseller lists, yes, reliable bestseller lists from that time, but there are a couple of ways of judging it, and some people estimate that was actually the best-selling book in America in 1861 as well.
Well, the other thing that you talk about that I find especially fascinating is the number of people, great writers, that were influenced by this book, like Jack London, for instance.
Yeah, this is one of those stories that the adventure story of Du Chaillu's trip to Africa became sort of a template for the action-adventure genre. Mm-hmm. It sparked a lot of it influenced a lot of different writers who would go on to write kind of in this adventure vein. Mm-hmm. And Du Chaillu's is kind of this unseen influence shaping the way that genre really kind of formed. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Jack London. Mm-hmm. He is somebody who first read Du Chaillu's book when he was a kid. And actually, when he died on his bedstand, he had books by Du Chaillu. He was a longtime fan. Others like, books that really kind of took off in the late 19th century and established the action-adventure genre. People like R.M. Ballantyne, who wrote The Coral Island. Mm-hmm. He wrote a sequel to The Coral Island called The Gorilla Hunters, and it was essentially a rewrite of Du Chaillu's adventures. Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World. A lot of the episodes and circumstances that book recounts shadow Du Chaillu's own adventures. There's the King Kong, of course, mm-hmm. is the most obvious example, and the co-director and writer Marion Cooper read Du Chaillu's book, he said, when he was, I think, 6 or 7, and admitted that was kind of what started him on the road of wanting to, being interested in adventure. And obviously you can kind of see a link between Du Chaillu's stories of gorillas and King Kong.
And then we have the other problem that you have Du Chaillu becoming this famous, recognized, admired explorer/researcher, and then someone along the line decides that he's not worthy of this, that perhaps he made it up, and after all, he is kind of low class, and he looks a little dark, and therefore he needs to be discredited because he's not one of us. Mm-hmm. So you got that whole Victorian class debate that he got embroiled into.
Yes, he stumbled sort of right into the center of that too. He had a real knack for kind of exemplifying his era. He had a knack for going right to the heart of different things that were very illustrative of the Victorian era. But yeah, you're right. He had a very shadowy past, and it was purposefully done. He obscured his personal history, and by the time that he became famous, people kind of caught up on some of the contradictions that he was telling about his past.
His own past, yeah.
His parentage, particularly, and his racial background.
Well, he knew the time in which he lived. If he didn't cover it,
yeah, exactly.
He would never gotten the time of day.
Right.
You know?
He at the time where there were no minorities who were in the Royal Geographical Society, for example. It just didn't happen, and so he obscured his parentage and obscured his place of birth. He would tell people sometimes that he was born in France, in Paris, other times in New Orleans or South Carolina, which is where Wilson had been born. And it was interesting when I first started looking into Du Chaillu's life, it seemed like every source that I consulted had a different birthplace for him. So those kind of fibs that he told really did last. And so when he died, if you look at encyclopedia entries for him, some will have him listed as born in Paris, some will say New Orleans, others will say New York, some will say South Carolina. It's just all those little deceptions that he kind of planted to obscure his past really did end up obscuring it. And but there were those who suspected something, started damaging rumors about him in an effort to kind of attack his credibility.
Kind of a whisper campaign.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I mean, we could go another hour on this, so we've kind of scratched the surface, and I hope we have whet people's appetite to want to read the entire book, because we've kind of got up to about halfway, and then we have the rest of the book where he has to make a second journey to prove he's legitimate, to prove that he actually did all these things, and then he comes back and eventually gets the honored celebrity he kind of deserves, although he did fade from history, and I don't quite understand how that happened given the enormous significance of his work. What are you working on now?
I'm doing some magazine work at the very moment. I just went to South America for a magazine and did a trip across the continent. So I'll be writing about that I'm writing about that at the moment to try to get that done.
And you were for about 7-8 years. You were the Washington correspondent in Argentina. Yeah,
for the Washington Post.
For the Washington Post.
The South America correspondent. So I was based in Argentina and covered the continent really for them.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. The book is Between Man and Beast, An Unlikely Explorer, Amazon's best book of the month. I cannot recommend it enough. It is a wonderful read, just at the level of adventure. If you just like a good adventure of going off into the wilds of Africa and hunting gorillas. Strangely enough, in this time, a lot of the hunting that went on was done in the name of love of animals. It was the only way to actually get them and preserve them for the public, to develop a love of them. We wouldn't do that today, but that's how it was done then. So pick up a copy of this. It's a wonderful read. You can download it on Amazon. It'll be a great way to spend your weekend. Thank you again, Monty, for joining us. I'm W.F. Strong for Good Books Radio.